a little bit about some of the things that we've already learned about our baboons here in Nature's Valley, and also about, what's it worth having a primatologist around? Like, what can we contribute to these conservation projects? Normally when you're thinking about primatologists, you're thinking about the types of people like Margaret and I, or the famous person, Jane Goodall. Most of the time we're spending our days hanging around in the forest with whatever species that we're studying. So that doesn't necessarily make for an immediate and easy link into thinking about applied conservation. And that's really what we're interested in doing here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing, some early results that we've got, and then where we are planning on going with all of this very cool data. And I just want to start by saying, if you love any of the photographs in these of our baboons in this talk to Sophie, because she's our fabulous photographer who's out there with the baboons every day collecting data on them. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about who we are and who the team is that we work with here. And we'll talk a little bit about baboon sort of basics. And these might be things that, a lot of people in this room already know because you live with baboons every day. But they're really important things that we think about when we're thinking about ways that we can live alongside them a little bit easier. And then we'll tell you about some specific things about our baboons that make them special, that make them different from other places in South Africa, and how we are directly applying the knowledge that we are gaining by following these baboons every day toward making their lives a little bit better and our lives a little bit better too. And then we'll end by talking about the big picture and our long-term plans. So for starters, I want to introduce everybody to all of the players on this team. So Hendry's introduced himself, but I also want to point out Sky because he's a really important part of our team. And during the times when Sophie couldn't be here or we couldn't be here, he's the one that kept this program going, and we're really, really, really grateful to have him on the team. And then, of course, there's Margaret and I and Sophie. As Hendry mentioned, Sophie is the one who sort of began the data collection here as part of an undergraduate senior thesis data collection. So she's the one that really started to get to know the baboons around here, while Margaret and I worked on coming up with a long-term scientific plan. And so we're sort of the research side of things, but the other half of the team that's really, really important is led by Rob Nickel and Marco, and this is our monitor team. So we think of ourselves as sort of a two-prong approach to dealing with finding a better way to move forward with baboons and humans living alongside each other. So we've got the monitor team and the scientific team, or the observation team. And the way that we work together with that team, and what makes it really, or like sort of how we start to make sure that we're being helpful as the primatologists on the team, is in addition to just following the baboons around and collecting data on what they're doing, we've also been able to sort of, through habituating them, see where they're going when the monitors can't see them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about directly how our two teams work together. But here I want to introduce a very, very important part of what makes this work, which is the NVT intern program. So between Sophie and Sky, they've trained with and worked with a number of interns that have come through the project. Anytime you see someone around the valley in one of these pink hats, this is our baboon observation team, our research team, who are doing the actual boots on the ground work of following these baboons. Okay, so I mentioned that we have a sort of two-pronged approach here. The monitor team has their role, we have our role, and then we work together to improve each other's teams. So on the monitor side of things, their goal is to sort of maintain buffer zones between humans and baboons, prevent tense interactions, and in the rare occasion that they occur, it's their job to help intervene by responding and herding the baboons back to a safe place where they won't be coming into contact with humans, but only when necessary and when we must. And then on our side, what we do is we watch the baboons, we record their behavior, apply what we're learning, and what's really important is that we don't do that interference. So we are, what makes it possible for us to be an early warning system and to always have our eyes on the baboons is by maintaining that sort of like journalistic distance where we watch, we record, but we don't directly intervene so that we can help let the monitors know what's going on as sort of like baboon spies sometimes. And like I said, we work very, very closely together, especially on our side, to make sure that we are supporting the monitors as best we can. And then of course the third facet of this really big team approach is community members. So community members play a really, really important part on this team. You know, we're here and the monitor team is here to support the community and to make sure that both baboons and community members are living their best lives. But of course we get a lot of inside information from you as well. So every part of this team is working together toward finding this sort of peaceful pathway forward with the baboons. So when it comes to observing and applying our information that we're learning just by watching things and being there and being aware of baboons' behavior as scientists, I just want to give two small examples of ways that we've already been applying those observations toward trying to improve some things. So recently, in recent months, Sophie has seen a few instances of people on the pass driving through and actually feeding the baboons. We think that these are probably tourists, not local people, but it can become a problem. And so one thing that's really great is having Sophie and the research team out there means that we were around to see these things and catch these things. And what we've done in response is just immediately put up signs in those areas where it's happening to help let people know that this is not a great idea. In addition to that, as I'm sure everybody here knows even better than I do, baboons do love to sneak into trash and get human foods in that way. So one thing that we've been doing here this week, actually, as a whole team, is replacing a number of bins that were pretty easily accessible down in the picnic sites by the bridge. And now what you'll see the next time you go down there is like all of those really open bins that the baboons can just pull things out of have been replaced by baboon-proof bins. And so this should immediately help to sort of stop them from getting into that human food waste and hopefully help alleviate and ease some of the naughty baboon behavior that's been going on down in those picnic areas. All right, so those are two ways that we're already trying to apply our what we're learning as quickly as possible to make things a little bit better. Now, beyond playing that sort of role, we also have sort of short-term and long-term goals that we want to contribute toward, like bigger, broader conservation goals as scientists. And we want to think about how we can use primate socioecology, which is what we're trained in and we do every day, toward these conservation goals. So socioecology is simply the combination of studying social behavior and ecological or environmental behavior. And what we do as primatologists is we go out, we follow the baboons every day, record what they're doing, and the point is to sort of figure out how their behavior interfaces with and is affected by the environments that they live in. And then, in turn, we study the other side as well. So how environment affects behavior and how behavior might also in turn affect the environment. And the big question that primatologists are usually sort of concerned with answering is thinking about how diverse social structures and behaviors and all of these really fun and interesting things that we see primates doing are linked to their environments. And so the type of data that we collect on these baboons is a combination of group level data and very focused individual data. So at the group level, we're recording where are they going, what sort of activities are they using, where are they spending their time, general activities, and then at the individual level, we're getting much more fine-grained detail on not just what their behavior is like and what they're doing from minute to minute, but also who they're interacting with, what their social system is like, and a lot of really detailed information about what they eat. And before I tell you a little bit about our baboons, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, just in case, to talk a little bit about baboon socioecology more broadly. So there are multiple species of baboons that live across different areas in Africa, and our baboons are the chocolate baboons. Generally speaking, across baboons, we're thinking about animals that are living in multi-male, multi-female societies that are relatively complex. And most of the time, we have situations where males are leaving their natal group. So once they hit sexual maturity, they're going off to find a new group, and the females stay in their group, and they have, their female relatives in the group with them. One thing that's really important across baboons, including our baboons, is that they are territorial. And not just males, but females will also participate in territory defense, where they're defending boundaries between themselves and the neighbors. And then, of course, just like they have complex social behavior, they also have complex diets. So one of the most difficult things that I have found about studying these baboons, as somebody with a stronger background in social behavior than feeding ecology, is that these baboons can eat just about everything. And that's great for them because it makes them very, very flexible to changing environments. But it can also make it really very interesting to figure out exactly what it is they're doing. And so when we're thinking about chacma baboons, there is a lot of work that's been done on baboons in other places. So in a paper that Sophie and Henry and I got together for the Nature's Valley Letters this year, we pulled together as many resources as we could find. In total, this is showing some summary information from 51 different groups of chacma baboons. And what we found is that, generally speaking, these groups can range in size from pretty small to pretty darn big. But on average, most groups of chacma baboons around South Africa tend to be around 50 individuals. Now you can see with the standard error on this, or sort of the standard deviation on this, that there's quite a wide range. So, if you're looking through the literature, you might see that groups can be from 4 individuals to 200 individuals. But on average, 49 is around the group size, and they have pretty large home ranges as well. So chacmas can live in small areas if they must, but usually their home ranges are around 13 square kilometers, and they have very long day ranges. And I'm going to tell you how the Nature's Valley troop fits into this picture a little bit later. So generally when we're thinking about chacmas, these are animals that take a pretty long time to grow up compared to other mammals. So females reach adulthood around 5 years old. They have their infants usually one at a time, and usually they can have one offspring every 2 or 3 years. And so here we have an image of a female with an infant and a juvenile, and then this is a very young infant that still has their natal coat. Now, males on the other side take an even longer to grow up. So they reach adulthood between 7 and 10 years, and it starts with their canines emerging, and then they start to get larger and larger bodies, and they can finally compete at full adult body size between 8 and 10. They tend to be quite a bit larger than females. As you all know, they can be up to about 35 kilos on the larger side of things. And they compete with each other, so if there are more than one male around, they will compete with each other for a sort of rank. So there's always sort of like one alpha, and then other guys below him. And the alpha is usually considered like the leader, and will often be the one that's leading group travel. And one thing that's really, really interesting about chacma baboons, especially compared to a lot of other primates where the females stay in their natal groups, is that most of the time what you see in those situations is that females have really close bond partners with their sisters, with their mother, with the other females in the group. But in chacmas, one thing that's really interesting is that the bonds between adult females and adult males seem to be very important. And as we're talking about behavior, this next slide is just showing a couple of things about males and females and also behavior. So, as we're thinking about differences between males and females, what we're seeing on this side is an adult male with a full yawn going on, and you can see a female on this side. And these are stock images. It's not from an actual interaction, but why I put them next to each other is for two things: to show the difference between males and females, but to also show a dominant and subordinate interaction. So this large male is showing his dominance, he's showing his canines, and this is actually a gesture that is meant to sort of show off how flashy he is and how important he is. And on the other side, this response here is what we actually call a fear grimace. So if you've ever seen a baboon who is baring their teeth in a way that looks almost like a smile, like this, That's not them telling you they want to fight you, that's them telling you that they definitely don't want to fight. They're very scared and they are openly admitting that you win. Like they are not trying to get started with anything. So even though it can look like a smile, it's actually a very fearful, submissive expression. Okay. And so in thinking about those relationships between sexes, one thing that's really, really cool and important about our baboons in terms of what makes them so scientifically interesting is that, if we go back to our sort of typical adult male here, if you spend enough time with our baboons, what you'll notice is that even though we do have some baboons of differing sizes, we do not have an adult male in this group. So at some point, a few months before Sophie started last summer 2023, oh yes, winter of 2023, my summer, your winter, the alpha male of this group disappeared and he has not been replaced. But what we do have is this juvenile male. And you can tell that he's a juvenile because when we look at his yawn, you'll notice those very conspicuous canines are very, very much missing. So even though he's trying his best, there aren't any scary teeth in there yet. And so this is Gromit, our sort of resident, trying his best to lead the group, but he's still quite young. So some details about our group in addition to Gromit. We have 6 cycling adult females. There's another juvenile male in addition to Gromit, who's a little bit younger than Gromit. And then we also have 1 juvenile female. And again, no adult males since somewhere between January and March of 2023. And so what this gives us an opportunity to do is ask some really, really interesting questions about what we're actually trying to answer. So right now we're working on collecting data of leaving sleeping sites in the morning and also general group travel to test some hypotheses about whether they're following the oldest females or the only male around. And it looks like it might be like our early results are showing that it might be a bit of a split depending on the situation, but we need a little bit more data to get enough to do the modeling. But yeah, trust me, as soon as we know, we will let you know. So we're really excited about it.
That's the leadership of what do you call travel.
Yeah.
What about discipline and social leadership?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so in terms of thinking about social leadership and discipline, I think one thing that can be a bit difficult when we're thinking about primates is they don't always have the same sort of rules that we have. Often in more despotic species of baboons, it is also the alpha male that does a lot of that sort of controlling behavior. And I think one thing that's quite difficult, especially when you have juveniles, like the ones that we have in this group, is usually if a juvenile were to act out of turn or get a bit too cheeky or start getting a bit big for his britches, I'll put it that way, it would be the adult or the alpha male that would keep them in place. But that would be usually in terms of within group relationships. But yeah, it's one of those open questions that is really very interesting to ask, and we're trying to answer, and it takes quite a bit of time because contextual leadership is
The
different.
reason I ask that is that when the alpha male disappeared or died, it seemed the rest of the males in our troop, the juvenile males, left.
Yeah.
And somebody, a lady who's a scientist, I don't know if she's a primate scientist, she said that there's a matriarchal structure that where the female will start to dominate, and she can kick those younger males out of the troop.
I think it depends. Gosh, there's so much variation between sites, between groups, between species, that every once in a while you will get a natural line that strong that they have control over things like that. But it could as easily be something like a strong natural line, or they just hit the right age and like fledged on their own, you know. But it's hard to say. We'll know what it is the next time.
What do you see in this group? How is this kind of male being placed? Who's taking the dominance?
Yeah.
As far as social behavior is concerned.
It's a very good question. So, as I mentioned with our poor canines male, he seems to be trying to fill that role in some ways, but he doesn't quite have the maturity to do so. And so what we are collecting data on is, and there are lots of impressions and anecdotes that we have, but what we're taking data on is, every time they come down from the trees, from their sleeping trees in the morning, who's the first to leave? What direction do they go in? Does everybody follow? Or do they split up sometimes? And then in addition to that sort of context, we're collecting the same sort of data when they're going from, resting in one place or feeding in one place to traveling to a new place. And it seems right now like it's sort of trading off between some different individuals, which isn't unexpected. There are even some groups that have been recorded as small as 4 individuals. So even just one adult male, one adult female, and a couple of young ones. It seems that there is variation in group size that's dependent upon how open the terrain is. So, if you're up in a really flat area or in the plains, chocolate baboons can live in much, much bigger groups. But in terrains like this, it's a little bit smaller. So it's hard to say because again, the average numbers, that we calculated do kind of hide a little bit of that variation. It's probably not a part of a splinter group. I mean, we can only say what we've seen and what we know. It does seem that, as Rob was mentioning, that the group might have been a little bit bigger in previous years. But as for now, no, this is the group. This is their range. They're definitely not a part of groups with neighboring groups. We've seen some intergroup encounters. This is them. Yeah. Okay. And so, speaking about territories, one of the papers that we contributed to Nature's Letter also included our early data about spatial use and ranging patterns in this group. And so I'll just tell you guys a little bit about that now. So we're using GPS hand units as we're following them, simply to take points of where they are, and what we're showing with this data is how they're spending time or in different parts of the valley, and sort of how they allocate their time in different habitat types as well. And what's great about this is, we can follow these baboons wherever they're going, whenever they're going anywhere. The only sort of caveat for us in terms of their travel is that we tend to stop at the edge of the village. So when we get to the village, we sort of stand back and we let the monitors do their job of herding the baboons back into sort of their space. And so the two questions that we're thinking about are, where are they spending their space when we can't usually see them or when they're not in the village, and what sort of things might they be doing in those spaces, and how does it change over time? And so the combined data shows us a heat map that looks a bit like this. So this is the pretty typical bird's eye view of the valley, and you can see that in addition to spending their time in the forest behind Forest Drive, they're spending a lot of time across the street, down on the other side of the river, and all around the valley. And so when we calculated their home range size and their daily range size, what we found is that compared to those sort of average measures that are coming from all over the country, our group of baboons, which has ranged from around 9 individuals to around 12 individuals since we started until now, has a home range of around 4.3 kilometers, and their daily range is quite a bit smaller. And we think that this has to do with a few things, but mostly we think that they're limited by the geography here. So we've got really big cliffs, there's plenty of food and some really great forest patches along those cliffs, and they don't need to go too far beyond. And we also think that they're a bit limited in going much farther than that because we have groups on either side of the valley that also have territories there. And then the next thing that we did is we sort of took that heat map of where they're spending their time, and we color-coded it by the type of forest or the type of habitat that it was, and we translated that into a bit of a time budget of where they're spending most of their time. And what you can see from the colors here, so orange is the forest, purple is the village, and what you can see is that they're overwhelmingly spending most of their time in the forest compared to actually being in the village. And this is great for us because it means that that is where they want to be most of the time, as long as it allows. And it's a good indication that there might usually be enough food in those areas for them as well. So over time, as we're continuing to herd them into those spaces, hopefully it will sort of stick, and that will change their behavior over time. You can see they also spend quite a lot of time on the road in this, in the data that we have so far. And we think when it comes to that, one thing that baboons do like to do when they're not needing to spend their time on feeding is spending time socializing with each other. And the road is a really great place for them to do that because it's open, they can see each other, and especially during the winter, it's a place that's quite a bit warmer than the forest might be. So they can warm up on the road and spend time there. And that's a pretty common place that baboons wind up in a lot of spaces, especially where they're living alongside humans. One thing that I would like to show you is a little bit of change over time, because I do want to validate a couple of things that you might have noticed this year compared to this time last year. So having a look at where baboons are in 2023 in the winter versus 2024 in the winter, you can see that there's a little bit more intensity of them spending their time in the space behind Forest Drive, and especially in that edge and maybe incurring in toward the valley. And one thing that seems to be happening is that there are more times and more instances of the baboons coming into the valley and coming into closer contact with people this year compared to last year. But what's really important is that it's not just happening here. It's actually happening on both sides of the valley with other groups as well. So with the Kobe group, there's also a little bit more baboon incursion into human areas, and also up on the other side. And so what we think might be happening here is that in addition to the usual changes, like in seasonal food availability, that it was just a particularly harsh winter, maybe a dry winter, and so the food availability is pretty low right now and a little bit lower than it might have been last year. And so hopefully, as the seasons change, and more food becomes available in the forest, that will shift again, and they will shift back into the forest and have more drawing them in that direction. And now that I've started talking a bit about diet, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Margaret Bryer, who is our nutritional expert and knows everything about nutritional ecology and how it shapes behavior.
Thank you. So after talking about the ranging behavior and thinking about where they might be moving in the valley and in the surrounding areas, one thing that we really wanted to look at for this project is what kinds of foods are these animals finding in different regions where they can range. So we have found, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to you, that they are pulling food from a variety of resources. So we have a lot of cases of them feeding on indigenous plant foods, fynbos, mushrooms, insects. We have some other interesting foods that we've observed them eating, including soil. I'll come back to that one. But then there are the slightly more complicated cases of alien invasives, which have implications for conservation concerns, indigenous ornamentals, alien ornamentals, and then of course I don't have to tell anyone in this room that they are seeking out human foods as well. So this reiterates what we already know about the diversity of the diet of baboons, but we can get into a little bit more detail thinking about what is pushing or pulling these baboons into different areas of the valley. And the valley is this really great opportunity to look at this intersection of forest resources, fynbos resources, and then the sort of mosaic landscape that intersects with the village. So I wanted to give you some examples of some of these categories of foods that they're eating, and you guys are going to recognize some of these plants. So these baboons are eating a variety of indigenous plants from the forest. They really love witch hazel or Cape hazel. They'll eat the seeds of that. Forest num-num, assegai fruits, black ironwood leaves. So, and then you probably are familiar with the fact that the baboons love forest grapes. So there was a period of time earlier this year where they were foraging a tremendous amount on forest grape fruits. So we have examples of all of these indigenous forest-based plants that the baboons are seeking out, which are really important to acknowledge from a conservation perspective, because we know that when they're going into the forest, or when we are potentially pushing them into the forest, that they have the resources that can provide them with the energy and nutrients that they need. And then we have some wonderful pictures from Sophie at Pig's Head of the Nature's Valley baboons eating fynbos. So there are multiple species of fynbos leaves that these baboons have been feeding on. And this is a whole other interesting aspect of indigenous plant foraging, to see an interaction between endemic plants in South Africa and the baboons that we're very excited to explore more. So a few of the fynbos species that we've observed them eating include fringed Cape Coris, bristlebrush, gona, and so we're interested to see what other fynbos potentially these baboons forage on. And then you guys may remember the last time we were here, there was a community talk all about mushroom foraging. So we are interested in mushroom foraging in non-human primates as well. And we've had some really interesting observations of our baboons feeding on particular mushroom species. And I should say that primates generally across the world do forage on mushrooms, but there is very little detail in the literature about the types of mushrooms that they're eating. So one really cool thing that we're doing all together as a team is working on identifying those mushrooms whenever the baboons are feeding on them. So a couple of examples. We've seen individuals in the group eating on deer mushrooms or pluteus mushrooms. And then more recently, Sophie saw them feeding on false turkey-tail, really going to town on feeding on this particular species of mushroom. And if you'd like to hear a little bit more about mushroom feeding in the Nature's Valley baboons, a second publication that we have in the Nature's Letters issue from April is specifically talking about that deer mushroom observation, where we saw a juvenile baboon in the group feeding on deer mushroom, and then also talking about how important it is to better understand these primate fungal relationships, in addition to understanding the relationships between plants and primates.
There's a constant race for mushrooms in this valley.
Yes.
You've got to run out to the forest to get them before the baboons get them.
Oh, I see, yes. Yeah, all the humans and non-human primates want the mushrooms. They do very good mushrooms in this valley.
The baboons are going to put out monitors to stop
Yeah, there's one other thing that I noticed, I don't know if it was in your list.
Yes.
At a certain time of the year, the baboons eat, there's a white protea that blooms up at the top. And it comes and they eat it and you see them discarded all over the road. Is this also, it seems to be the heart of the plant they're trying to get to?
Yes. So have you observed that one? So I mean, one thing that we definitely have noticed with some of the baboon feeding is that they won't consume, and I'm sure you have also noticed, is that they'll consume part of the plant and then discard the rest.
Yeah.
They do this with wild onion as well. And so, you know, the implication is that they're interested in one particular part of the plant. So with the protea would be the sort of the central part of it.
At a particular time of the year, you get those beautiful, big, giant white proteins, and they eat those.
Yeah.
What time of year is that? Do you know? Like, is it a certain month?
It was before you got here, so I don't know if any of you saw them. Those proteins lying all over the road, the white ones.
The white sugar bush is full of nectar.
Yeah, it's
Yes,
the nectar.
okay.
And the bearded proteas, they also do
Okay.
treatments of. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And
They're
Very
seeking
high
out the
sugar
nectar.
content.
That was earlier this year. So
Yeah,
sort
just
of,
trying to.
Yeah. No, that's
find somebody who knows when that then
Yeah.
comes
Yeah.
out. But it was
Absolutely.
prolific. I mean, everywhere you went were these bushes discarded in the road
wow.
on the R102 as you go out towards the farm store. All along that road, they had attacked these bushes and
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, because feeding on flowers by primates is a really interesting resource in terms of sugar content. There are certain floral situations where they might be getting fat content, so there's some really interesting nutritional implications of targeting the center of those
I think
flowers.
we should take note of that and let
Yes.
you guys know when we start seeing them.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be great. I wanted to touch on a couple other food resources that may not come to mind immediately when you're thinking about baboons. So we have observed the baboons eating insects. I am particularly interested in insectivory and primates because I think it's a little bit understudied and has some really interesting implications in terms of micronutrients, so thinking about minerals and vitamins that primates might need that they often can get from insects that they might not be able to get as much from plant foods. But the baboons have been seen eating termites as well as ants. So this is a still from a video that Sophie took where one of the baboons was ripping apart a dead log and eating live termites. So this is an aspect of their foraging that we're continuing to look at, and I think also links very well in terms of how these baboons are interacting with forest resources beyond plants and the potential implications in terms of forest restoration. And then I did want to touch on one food resource that may come to us as a surprise to some people, although maybe you've observed the baboons feeding on soil before. But we observed members of the group feeding on soil on the side of the road. And that may seem odd, but actually there are a lot of examples of non-human primates and humans actually eating soil. So in this case, we can potentially test the nutrition or other components that are in this soil in the future. As Kris mentioned, I'm a nutritional ecologist, so in the long term, potentially getting at some of the nutritional resources they're getting from these foods would be really exciting. I would hypothesize, though, that there probably are mineral resources in these soils. There also is the potential for detoxifying foods that they're eating. So there have been other studies where primates will eat soil after they feed on a plant food that has toxic or other plant secondary compound components to sort of detoxify that food. So that was a really cool observation, and we're looking forward to exploring that more when we have more soil observations. And then we've seen the baboons eating a lot of alien invasives, and I wanted to point out that several of these species overlap with the alien invasives guide that Nature's Valley Trust has put together, and that's available online. So you'll recognize these alien invasives generally, but also there's this really great guidebook that NVT has made that has descriptions of each of them. Here on the right you have Nature's Valley baboons feeding on the roots, shoots, and leaves of spiderwort or wandering dude. There's also a lot of evidence of them relying on kikuyu grass. We've observed them eating black wattle leaves and fruits, I believe. And then Australian water pear is also a favorite of the baboons, which probably comes as no surprise, having these perfect little fruits that look quite juicy. So we've seen the baboons' interest in that invasive as well. And so this aspect of their diet is especially informative for thinking about reforestation and removal of invasives, because I know that NVT has this very strong invasives removal program, but if we have baboons dispersing seeds of invasives, then that has implications for going against the goal of removing all invasives. So quantifying how much they're relying on these invasives and how they might be propagating them is an important piece. And that's not just for fruits and seed dispersal. Skye has definitely talked to me about the fact that the wandering dude species can definitely propagate just by being broken into pieces and can spread that way. So there are implications of the baboons feeding on these plants in terms of our ability to reduce invasives. And then I wanted to briefly mention the fact that we are looking at different levels of health. So ecosystem health, we can think about the baboon's role in the ecosystem and what they're foraging on in terms of what really important roles they play. So baboons, like other mammals and other herbivores in this environment, can be key seed dispersers. And that can be in the context of invasives, like I was just talking about, or it can be in the context of indigenous plants. So they can help with seed dispersal in relation to indigenous plants in a positive way as well. You've probably seen baboons digging in the dirt at certain times when they're foraging for various foods. This actually serves a soil aeration effect, which can be very important for soil moisture and oxygen. And then with the mushroom example, we can think about not only soil aeration in the context of foraging for mushrooms, but you can also think about the potential of baboons serving in spore dispersal, so helping with reproduction of mushrooms as well. And so we're interested in figuring out the various resources they're pulling from, how they are part of this ecosystem, and I think one of the really important aspects of this project is that it really can be an ecosystem-wide project because of NBT. NBT is able to have projects across all aspects of the ecosystem, and the Baboon Project can be part of that ecosystem-wide project. In addition to thinking about ecosystem health, we also in the project are thinking about baboon health as well and monitoring their health and welfare while we are also looking at their behavior and feeding behavior. So we wanted to just touch on a couple of examples in Nature's Valley Troop, in our baboon troop, of both naturally occurring health concerns and then human-related health concerns. So on the left here is an adult female who had an ear infection. So we have been monitoring her behavior, and she actually is improving quite well. And so there's no intervention involved. It's just the fact that because we have this team on the ground monitoring the baboons almost every day, we're able to see indications of illness and then monitor the individual, make sure that they're still integrated in the group, that they're not seeming to be struggling. And then on the right here, as I'm sure all of you have noticed, there are a couple of juvenile individuals who are missing limbs. And this is related to, this is an example of a human-related injury. This individual on the right here is actually missing his front forearm and back hind limb. And we know from observation that this was due to interacting with an electrical wire. So this is an electrocution-related injury where he initially had the injury and then the limb fell off. We hypothesized that a similar thing happened to this juvenile female. She also is missing her forearm. The thing I want to emphasize is that though, of course, these are catastrophic injuries, these two individuals are doing really well. This young juvenile male is moving around remarkably well. His injuries have healed. This young female also has healed remarkably well. And we have the team on the ground monitoring their health and making sure that there isn't any sort of regression. But I think this is a really important demonstration of baboon resiliency and their ability to recover from these kinds of injuries.
There was some talk of the one injury being due to a fight between the troops. The one was caught and had the hand pulled off by a big male on the other troop. Now, I don't know if that's rumor or what, but it was at the time that we know there was a big battle that took place down near the water station. I think it was with the Cozy troop.
Oh, so I wasn't aware of that interaction, but that's really interesting information.
I think it did turn out to be like two sort of competing stories that were ideas about the same injury, but it did turn out, and I think there's still space for plausibility there, but I think that probably how that injury would have happened would have been after this electrocution event. Because it turned out the monitors
at the same time as
and so we think
so it could have been bit of both.
Exactly. So that's what we think. We think that's because somebody, one of the monitors actually saw him get a bit zapped, and so the sort of order of operations that we've reconstructed is electrocution, and then possibly it made it worse, but the damage had already been done, and that's what made it possible to like get pulled off.
But to the question, I suppose, more one of
Sure.
Do they get into fights where baboons are killed or injured in that way?
Our group or generally?
Just generally.
Generally, yeah. So I would say that intergroup encounters between groups can be quite violent. In this particular troop, we have not had, or in our observations, we have not had direct contact. We've only had vocal contact between groups so far. But in baboons more generally, yes, sometimes those intergroup encounters can be quite violent.
But
Somebody
usually
said
what you
about a large male coming
Yeah.
in, if an alpha male came into the troop, the chances are that some of the offspring of the previous would get killed.
Yeah, so here two really good things about this would be, so I mean, in terms of thinking about the ways that the injuries can sort of play out, usually what you're going to see are things like puncture wounds and like slashing wounds, right? Most of the time when you have an injury that's ending in an amputation, it's not from another individual, because you'd just be really surprised how strong those joints are. It's really hard for a fight like that to lead to basically an amputation injury. But when it comes to a new male coming in, absolutely there's a threat to any young infants. All of the individuals in our group are way past that now because they're all fully into the juvenile stage, so they would be quite safe. But also the upside is, so as I was reflecting on your question about thinking about alpha males and thinking about who sort of maintains the peace in the group, and one of those really famous examples is of older male elephants. So if you go into a population and take out the old male elephants, the younger males tend to have much worse behavior when they go into rut. They go into rut more often, and all it takes is reintroducing another old male elephant to help tamp that all down. And that can be really similar across most primates, because those older males usually have a little bit, even though they're quite fierce, they usually have better control over their emotions. They're not, they're not pubertal males that just are getting their teeth and don't know how to use them. And so our troop would be safe, and it could also have actually a bit of a calming effect depending on who the male is. So I think it would actually be great for us to get an adult male, because it will actually also help us keep those territory boundaries if we have an interaction, whereas right now, in an interaction like that, we don't have much of a defense. I mean, the females in Gromit are going to try their best, but I don't know if they could stand a chance against me.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's next. So we've talked about the observation team's role of informing the monitors about baboon travel and position, observing and applying what we found. Next up, of sharing results. So we're sharing results with you, part of the team, the community, and then we also are sharing results in the context of conferences, as well as the Nature's Letters publication that I was showing you. So actually, in the next couple of days, Hendry, Kris, Sophie, and I will be at the African Primatological Society, where we'll be presenting both on the mushroom foraging, and Sophie will be presenting her an updated version of her thesis results in terms of ranging. So these are some of the ways in which we are sharing this information, both with the most important set of audiences, which includes you, and also speaking with other primatologists and other scientists and networking about ideas in the context of professional conferences. And then we want to think about long-lasting benefits to humans and baboons as we move forward in this project. Again, this is an extremely collaborative project that's going across a lot of stakeholders, and we want communication to be open across those different teams. And we really think that we can reach a point where we are integrating the baboon behavior and welfare questions into these larger scale ecosystem questions, as well as the forest programs upscaling that is going to be happening in the near future. So some ways of thinking about this. So we've been talking about how we are looking at what the baboons are feeding on. We can think about nutrition and population growth in the baboons as we think about baboon health and baboon behavior and welfare, and how that feeds into the reforestation efforts that Hendry and the forest program are spearheading. Another aspect is looking at insectivory or insect eating in the context of forest reforestation, thinking about the roles that insects, baboons, and reforestation play in this upscaling of forest restoration. And then as part of the upscaling effort by NBT, there's talk about the role of forest patches. So this idea that we, in the reforestation effort, need to focus on the value and the growth of forest patches. So forest patches can have a variety of resources for insects, baboons, and other organisms in them. And there can be sort of a feedback loop in thinking about how forest restoration efforts can inform baboon welfare and vice versa. And we're really excited to work with all of you in building this program and thinking about long-term, sustainable ways in which humans and baboons can coexist. Thank you so much.
Right.